Good morning, good morning, good morning. I believe we are live. I am attempting to make sure that our room is open. Appears to be so. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the ADAMA Art Salon. This is edition number 21, and I am Dr. Fahamu Puku. I'm the founding director of ADAMA, the African Diaspora Art Museum of Atlanta. And as we like to say here, everywhere we go, there we are. And today's guest is a perfect example of our mantra. She's Lauren Tate Baeza, the Fred and Rita Richmond Curator of African Art at the High Museum. I should say the newly appointed Fred and Rita Richmond Curator of African Art at the High Museum here in Atlanta, Georgia. And we are thrilled to have you with us today. Good morning, Lauren. How are you? Oh, I think you're muted.
Good morning.
Good morning. It's great to see you. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, no, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. It's, you know, a little surreal that our first meeting is via Zoom. But I look forward to, you know, meeting in person in the very near future. First of all, I guess we should start by asking how are you feeling? How's everything going, you know, for you since you're
it's
a new
great.
appointment?
I'm so excited. It's you know, early. I've only been at the High for a couple of weeks, but I'm just very inspired and excited for the potential of what I'm going to be able to do there, and spending a lot of time trying to learn the collection. And had a little break and went to Africa recently for an arts festival in Dar es Salaam, which filled me with even more inspiration. So I'm ready to go. That's how I feel.
That's awesome. It's great to hear. It's great to hear. I wanted to you know, take a little bit of time here to give our audience a little bit of a snapshot as to, you know, who you are and your background. I know that you know, in addition to being a curator, you've also done some work in other areas that are not necessarily related to curation or even directly related to the art world or the art establishment that you also bring to bear in your position. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to this position?
Sure. So I should say, I think that art was always a part of my world in a way that I probably took for granted. My parents surrounded us in music. Going to museums was a regular thing that we did as a family. And I was encouraged to participate in the arts. I started studying ballet at 2. I took drama lessons off and on throughout the entire time I was growing up. Ended up going to performing arts high school. I was briefly interested in drawing. Took my first drawing class when I was around 12, did that for a little bit. And I think I want to stop here and say, I think sometimes we, and by we, I just mean everyone, people, we sometimes have a tension between what we're good at and what we want to do, if that makes sense. I felt like I got a lot of reward for doing things artistically, but I don't know that I ever really wanted to be the artist.
Okay.
And so when I started to sort of sort that out, I thought that I might have some proximity to art by being a creative writer or a critic or a curator or doing something administrative in a museum, and was actually thinking about studying art history, but found art history programs to be very Western. And that did not work well for me. And so, you know, to imagine that one continent would be the entire curriculum of a art history program, essentially, with some special courses that were non-Western, didn't measure up with how I understood art or what I saw, or even just how vast the globe is. There were entire continents, billions of people not represented in these programs that had to be producing art. So I jumped ship and studied African studies and took a cultural studies emphasis. And the entire time that I was in my undergraduate Africana studies program, I interned at art museums in Los Angeles.
Okay.
And sort of created my own African art program, if you will. But by the time I got to the end of undergrad, I had written and done so much research around post-colonial African history and geography, and was very frequently trying to use prompts I saw in collections at some of the museums I interned in to unpack more historical types of research, but just using art and artifact as a way as an entry point for those kinds of conversations or research. And the professors and mentors that I had at the time were just really taken by my scholarship around African political history, and thought that I might be able to lend my talents to working for a multilateral organization like the African Union or the UN. And in order to sort of prepare for that or entertain if that was even something I would be open to doing, I started working for some NGOs. I went to Africa, working for some non-governmental organizations that were almost always looking at environmental issues, food policy issues. And I'm glad I did that work. I think that it informs my practice in a more nuanced way than if I had just done sort of a classical art history. And makes me a particular type of culturally sensitive and politically aware curator when it comes to African artifact and contemporary art. And I'm grateful for it. But it was just an opportunity for me to learn even more deeply how much I love museums. I missed it terribly. I got a bit disillusioned with nonprofit work, especially as a Westerner coming into Africa. Even though I look like this, I'm very aware of my Americanness and the organizations I was working for and their Americanness. And so I thought that I would be, I thought it would be best that I returned to museums, and that's what I did.
Okay. And, you know, I think, you know, one of the things that's really interesting about that, the sensitivity that you speak about to African history, African culture, you know, both historically and contemporaneously, is something that is often overlooked in a lot of museum spaces. You know, in your recent TED Talk, I mean, I'm sorry, not TED Talk, but your Creative Mornings talk from February of this year, you spoke about the importance of context as it relates to different objects, and particularly you were referring to the Martin Luther King collection and the importance of it staying in Atlanta. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about those experiences as well, because your curatorial practice isn't just isn't just around like art objects and, you know, like quote unquote art objects, but also around culture and memory.
Yeah. Wow. February feels so long ago, right?
Yeah, it
When you
really
said
does.
this year, I was like, that was this year?
Right.
Wow. Yes. I think of my role, whether I'm curating art or, objects like the materials in the Morehouse College Martin Luther King Jr. collection, as a storyteller first. And um, I think that that's important to say because I do find that frequently, and this is an approach that is fine, I suppose, it's just not my approach, that exhibitions are sometimes very broadly thematically organized,
Mhm.
and there's not a real narrative, at least not one that people can grab onto readily. And so I try to make sure that I am communicating a story and I'm really intentional about what objects are in dialogue with one another, and try to tell that story as much as possible without text, but then lend some text to help connect some dots here and there without doing too much of the intellectual labor, because I think people should. I think the best exhibits allow people to interpret the things that they
Mhm.
need. But I think that if you're telling a story about an object, uh, then it has to, I don't know how to not include the origins of that object,
Mhm.
what that object has lended to other things. I do think that the place is important, and if you can't be in that place, that you call that place into the space. So if the King Papers are not in Atlanta, then you have to still talk about Atlanta,
Right.
right? And so the same would be true for objects from the continent.
Mhm.
And I also would, I'm fortunate to live in a city that has one of the largest African immigrant communities in the country. So I don't set out to do things alone. I would probably always, if I could, time permitting, invite the community into my ideation phases
Mhm.
and provide an opportunity to hear about what they think about these objects. I know that you are probably familiar with this, but for people watching that may not be, a lot of the objects and collections are inaccurate because Africans told inaccurate things on purpose.
Mhm.
They wanted to keep their secrets, and they didn't trust the colonial powers that were present and asking to take some of their artifacts, asking. And so they would tell them, misinformation deliberately and intentionally. And then that information ends up getting published in museums. And so I think there has to be if I'm going to try to honor the objects authentically, there has to be an ongoing conversation with the community that the objects represent,
Right.
um, and pulling those voices into the room with the objects.
Yeah, I think this, it's always really fascinating to discover those little sort of like trickeries. I think there's such a um, sort of domineering conception of ignorance, right, amongst African communities. When we talk about objects being looted and we talk about um, uh, the sort of like imposition of colonialism. There's this assumption that you know that the people who were being colonized or the people who were having their artifacts looted did not have the wherewithal, right? To also play into those perceptions and use that to their advantage in many instances. And so it's always I think about that a lot when I think about work by artists like Basquiat, for example. So many people have attributed this sort of like youthfulness or like childlike nature to Basquiat's work, but when you really get into it, you realize just how super intellectual and tricky he
Mm-hmm.
was. Yeah, and I think
Yeah,
those discoveries are fun. But
they
again,
really are.
absent the context, I think people really struggle to understand that.
Yeah, I love that you brought up Basquiat because it's totally a thing the diaspora did. We did with language,
Mhm.
we did with all kinds of things to sort of hide and codify, like,
Mhm.
um, our own personal, deeply meaningful culture. Like we would,
Mhm.
do it in religion. Yeah, sure, we're being Catholic, right? Like we would hide it, and so some of those things that we hid, um, and deliberately confused our oppressors with, they ended up buying at face value and
Right.
publishing and putting in museums, and it's inaccurate. And it is. It's like a testimony to the brilliance of that.
Right.
You think at gunpoint you were given accurate information?
Right.
You know, it's kind of absurd.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about your travels too, because you have a really interesting, again, coming out of your Creative Mornings talk, you know, the notions of diaspora color your not only professional career, but your personal life as well. And can you talk a little bit about how those journeys and the different places that you've lived and interacted inform your practice?
I mean, I think the community building I talked about and engaging the people that I aim to represent in an exhibition is informed very specifically by my experiences working with NGOs on the continent. I was fortunate enough to work for organizations that wanted to make sure that they took the time to have community-driven, community-led projects, and that we were in a support function and we weren't leading the initiatives in terms of creating what the initiative even was. We would stop, you know, and stay in a community as long as we needed to really understand what the problems were on their own terms, as opposed to walking in with our Western biases about what problems we thought we saw. And that has had a tremendous impact on me. Just that practice of listening, and it not, and anything that I create not just being from my own mind, and my own inclinations and things that I like, and all of the biases that would be in that, right? My American biases, my Black American biases, my heterosexual biases, like whatever I'm doing, if it's supposed to be in service to the community, which I think public exhibitions and spaces like museums that are educational institutions, they are in service to community, that I am aware of that, and that I make sure that I'm actually listening to the community in the first place. In terms of just where I've lived personally and traveled, I don't know if that is something that I can see how it shows up in my practice as much as that is an extension of how I was raised.
Okay.
My parents are just they raised us to be very global citizens. I should say my parents were activists and they were Pan-Africanists, and I was sort of indoctrinated with this belief that the world belonged to me, and that everyone of African descent was my brother and sister. And so I just wanted to go visit my other homes.
I love that. I love that. It's, you know, it's part of the reason that, you know, like with ADAMA, you know, we say that everywhere we go, there we are, right? Because it is true what you say is that, you know, it's almost like wherever we show up, we're often reminded, you know, of the things that connect us as opposed to the things that make us, that separate us or that make us different. Particularly when we talk about diaspora, you know, whether it's the food or the dance or the music or you know, the art or the expression is very familiar, you know, wherever you travel. And that's always a really affirming thing that I really wish more of us would experience or would seek out, you know, because it does ground you in a way that I think resists, you know, the kind of expressions that we are accustomed to in this context.
Absolutely, absolutely. Everyone in the diaspora should travel. It's everything that, you know, I mentioned my parents were Pan-Africanists. They raised me to think this way, but to see it was just so much more affirming. Like to go to a place where you can't necessarily speak the language or anything, and to still see yourself, to see your aunt, to eat a food that's familiar, to smell a certain scent in the air, and you're like, that's the same incense, right? Like just to feel that truly global community, and where that West African, you know, culture has been so resilient in things like language and food and sentence structure, and to see that in all these disparate places in the world is so incredible and validating, especially if you grow up in a place where you are systemically oppressed.
Right.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I want to kind of shift gears a little bit to talk a bit about your appointment at the High Museum. And we kind of talked about this a little briefly offline, but you know, as I was preparing for our conversation today, and I should say, full disclosure, I'm also a trustee on the board of the High Museum. As I was preparing for our talk today, I was trying to do my research to find out if there had been any other Black curators at the High Museum, and I could not find that anywhere. I believe not only are you certainly the first uh, uh, Black woman curator of the African collection, I believe you are the first Black curator at the High Museum in its history.
Yes, I am. I am. I'm the first, from what I've been told, by the High. I'm the first non-white full curator. They've had consultants and things like that, but in terms of being a staff member, I am the first non-white person of color in general, not just the first Black curator in the 115-year history.
That is absolutely stunning. You know, especially at an institution that lives in a city like Atlanta that has this rich history of Black uh, artists and creatives and intellectuals and activists and leaders. You know, that institution, you know, of that, with that visibility, has not had you know, a curator of color on staff. You know, congratulations to you for that. I mean, it says a
Thank
lot.
you.
It says a lot about you, but it also, you know, brings up really interesting questions and challenges about like the culture of museums, and the ways in which, you know, they are, you know, wrestling with uh, relevance and connection and engagement across communities. But you know, before I go into all of that, I did want to ask, like, you know, have you already begun to uh, think about what kinds of things you would like to do at the museum? Have you already begun to plan exhibitions or acquisitions, or are you just still kind of getting your feet wet?
Um, I have, I am still learning the collection, and as I mentioned, that's a priority right now. I try to make decisions informed by what's happening in my environment and try to find the opportunities.
Mhm.
Um, of course, I have ideas in my mind, but I think I need to sit with it and really see what I need to respond to. I can share with you what I've gathered already and something
Mhm.
that I've been very excited about, which is something that I noticed about the High's collection before I was a part of the team. And um, their collection, the collection of African objects represents about 26 of the 56 countries slash territories. And of that 26, there are very few objects from each country.
Mhm.
There are what I would consider a substantial amount of objects from about 5 countries of those 26, and they're all in West and Central Africa. But especially of those five, two have a very strong representation, and that is those are objects from the modern day Democratic Republic of Congo and Nigeria.
Mhm.
Um, and so what I saw when I saw that was a really great opportunity to continue this point of distinction that existed already, right? For whatever reason, that's tended to be where we've collected from before me. And I think to make the High sort of be a premier place for items from those regions is probably the best use of our way forward and our best way to highlight and put to use all of the collecting that's happened thus far. And so the opportunity to diversify for me is not to represent more African countries and, you know, for example, trying to fill in the remaining 20 some odd or whatever, but to diversify our offerings from those two
Mhm.
places, because I
Okay.
do think that that's an opportunity for us. And this is kind of museum wide, there's an overrepresentation of religious objects.
Mhm.
And I think as an educational institution, when we're collecting things and thinking about future generations, learning more about the history of these regions, it would be irresponsible to only have what we have represented be how people imagined the non-material world. I would really like to make sure that we have objects that communicate how people lived every day, what kind of objects they actually used for things like cooking, because those things absolutely have aesthetic value as well.
Right.
Military objects, for example, things that show how society is organized beyond the spiritual. And also there tends to be a lot of wood objects in African art collections worldwide. Smelting technology has been in Africa since at least the 8th century. I think having more metal objects, things made out of different types of materials would be of interest for thinking about the past. And then I think we definitely want to move forward with expanding our contemporary art holdings, especially from those places, which I'm excited about because I actually happen to find the DRC to be one of the most exciting places for artistic production right now. Yeah. And so it's great. Like we have this grounding in material culture and historical objects from the DRC. And so now we get to kind of continue to have this discourse with that region of the world at a really great time for contemporary art in that particular geography.
I was going to ask about that too, because I think, as I've been able to travel and interact with artists and art spaces, across the diaspora, particularly in Europe, I've been able to connect, and even on social media, I've been able to connect with so many absolutely dope contemporary artists from across the continent. Yet representation of those works in museum collections is very, very far and few in between. There's such I think you kind of spoke about this in your talk about the sort of exotification, of objects out of context. And there seems to be this sort of like exoticism in traditional objects, masks and sculptures and things of that nature. But, but there isn't a real connection to what's happening now, which is not just now happening. It's been, happening, all this time. It's just, in Europe and particularly in a lot of galleries, you're starting to see a trend towards contemporary African art that's not necessarily being voiced in institutions. And I'm curious to know like how you see that changing or evolving, in your experience.
I think that is probably something that's going to evolve very slowly. I hope to play my part. And again, like grounding, this all in the collection that we currently have. I think that it would be relatively easy for me to explain why we should have these contemporary African artists in our collection or on display or both. But I think, I don't know, I think the US is particularly behind the ball. For example, with regard to the DRC, there have been a couple of really great group shows in Europe highlighting Congolese artists. One was in Germany, the other was in Belgium, I believe. No, it was in Switzerland. America's just not really paying a whole lot of attention, I don't think. And I think perhaps once things finally start to happen over the Atlantic, my hope is that once things finally start to happen over the Atlantic, trickling in, hopefully I'm a part of that, that then it will sort of happen quickly. But I think we've got to get those first couple of shows up and just show people.
Right.
I've had the opportunity to show people some of the artists that I really love, working in the Congos or from the Congos, and they're all blown away. The work is so strong. There's just an awareness issue. But I think it's one of those things where you have to slowly bring it in, and then hopefully it'll compound and become a bigger movement. so that the artists can start to make some money for their brilliance and bless us all with their talent and
Yeah,
work.
yeah, for sure. I'm also thinking about the uh, the rise of the contemporary fairs that the center African continent, or more broadly, the African diaspora. And this is something that, I don't know if you're going to consider this like a tough question or not. So I hope not, though. But it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. Again, sort of inspired by my travels, in visiting contemporary African art fairs like Accra and others, where they describe themselves as African diasporic art fairs. But on the flip side, right, whereas we talked about, the United States sort of being behind the eight ball as it relates to the presentation of work by contemporary African artists, one of the things that I've also sort of paid attention to is the lack of American or US-based artists being represented in those African diasporic, art fairs. In fact, my conversation with Vitry, my participation with the upcoming biennial in Kinshasa, really sort of came out of that conversation. That as a Black American artist, my work is also in conversation with contemporary artists from the diaspora, from the continent, from Europe, but those works are not being considered in these fairs. Have you had any conversation around that, or any thought about those disparities?
For me, that conversation, I thought that might be where you're going. For me, that conversation is I always have that conversation with Africans. Um, I'm not usually asking anybody, a European institution or a European organizer, to make sure you include the diaspora. But I do tell my African colleagues that I think the word diaspora too is it's a broad term. For some, that means, there was a lot of conversation when I was in Tanzania week before last at an art fair about regional cooperation and trying to get arts institutions in places like Zambia, DRC, Tanzania to be working together. It's thinking especially about countries that neighbor each other, but also just broadly about just intra-African collaboration and pulling together resources to produce art exhibitions and so forth. And that's diaspora too. Like the word diaspora is used in that context, like Africans working with Africans in other countries. Right. And then diaspora is also sometimes used to talk about direct African immigrants, living and working in Europe and America. So when you're talking about people that came to the Western Hemisphere hundreds of years ago, sometimes we are not what people actually mean when they say diaspora. And so I think I have taken it upon myself to stand up for myself in African spaces and say, hey, remember us? I actually had the opportunity to do that. I was speaking on a panel at the National Arts Alliance in Dar es Salaam a couple of weeks ago, and kind of basically said that. I said that I encourage Africans to remember us when they're coming together at these roundtables to talk about collaborations between countries on the continent, that they think about the Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Latin, and African-American people as well. We would love to join you at that table. If you reach out, we will grab your hand. So that's how I've been approaching that so far.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about our collective, and when I say collective, I'm referring to you and myself, collective Pan-Africanist roots, and the legacy of the late 60s, early 70s, where there was a great deal of discourse between Black Americans in the United States and Africans in various countries on the continent. There were festivals and collaborations like Festac and other events like that sort of disappeared. And it almost feels as if those kinds of conversations are starting to re-emerge. And it's very inspiring. It's a hopeful that we can do something like build really significant bridges. You know, and so I'm looking forward to seeing your role in facilitating some of that as well.
Yeah. And I think, unfortunately, there is no, I think I said this when I was on that same panel, there is no like state of Black America. There's no United States of Black
Right.
America. Like, so when they're talking about regional cooperation, in some ways, I think for all of its difficulties, I think it's easier because they have these national bodies, right? They can have their national arts organization of one country speak to the national arts organization of another country, and Kenya and Uganda can go somewhere and they have these governing bodies to sort of facilitate this collaboration. But we don't really have that. So I think it has to happen at an individual level, which is why I take every opportunity to speak up about it and make sure that they offer to include us when they can. Because it's always happened, even in the 60s and 70s, as you mentioned, it was really happening at an individual level, right? There's no national agenda that's going to include the Black American,
Right.
and especially not in the arts. So we have to sort of make sure that we're facilitating these person to person where we can.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to in terms of that sort of advocacy work that institutions like ADAMA, for example, could kind of fill in the void to create those kinds of conventions, so to speak, that really do try to aggregate, a voice that can be represented, in these spaces as well. So I want to, kind of take it, maybe a little bit of a softer curveball question. Like, who are the artists that you're looking at right now? Who excites you?
Oh my goodness. I'm going to stick with my DRC theme.
Okay.
So we spoke about Vishwa, and some of the people that he's mentored, like Eddie Ilunga. There's he's from other Congo Brazzaville, I believe, but there's an artist Kuka Ntandi.
Okay.
Sammy Baloji's been doing things for a while now, from Lubumbashi in the south. Those are just a few that come to mind, but I've really just been paying a lot of attention to that country in particular. Yeah.
Okay. Anybody stateside that you're looking at, thinking about?
I'm trying to really think about the continent and have everything be sort of continent first. So I know that my predecessor had sort of a Black Atlantic perspective on the collection. I think that's fine, but I think that for me, the continent is just already so diverse that trying to sort of represent the Caribbean and Black American experience as well in that collection isn't the best way to interpret the collection unless there's like an Africa First exhibition. So for example, if I'm talking about religious practices in West Africa, and then as a part of that exhibition, maybe we talk about what's happening in Haiti and New Orleans and Santeria and Umbanda and things like that. That would make sense to me to include the diaspora, but it has to be an African-led and African-focused collection. I worry that if it becomes sort of a catch-all Blacks only section, that it continues to enable American art departments, contemporary art departments, and so forth, photography departments and so forth, to not collect from Black Americans and so forth that might actually fit better in the canon of their collection. I try to stay away from that because I feel like that is a very real concern. And I feel like I've observed that at other museums. I don't ever want to be the Blacks only section. I do want to truly be an African art, African art department. So right now, to be honest with you, my focus is deep in continental African living artists.
Yeah, and I think you make a really great distinction there too, because there's a lot of controversy around collecting areas, abstract art, abstract expressionism, contemporary photography, et cetera, that have grossly overlooked contributions by Black American artists for decades. I think it's important to make those distinctions that the works fall into certain schools of thought and certain collecting areas that have been greatly overlooked. And yeah, we don't need it's the all Black section. It should really, the collecting area should be just as diverse as the institutions aspire to have their audience, as well as their um, staff and board. That those notions of diversity should expand into all areas.
Yes.
So to those who are watching us now, if you have any questions for Lauren, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A section, and I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll engage your questions. But yeah, you can use the Q&A feature to drop any questions in, and we'll put those into our conversation. But my last question that I wanted to ask you, Lauren, actually came out of an article that I read this morning in the Washington Post. It's an interview with Helen Molesworth, who is a 20-year museum veteran, has served as curator at a number of really prestigious institutions. But the question was asked of her, how can museums change their practices, their policies, their engagements to be more inclusive beyond just lip service. And the idea that Molesworth sort of floated around was that in her observation of contemporary museums, that many of the leadership, the white leadership at these institutions, have tried to address that by changing the faces of the people at the table, when instead they should be considering how to change the table altogether. Which is an idea that she also acknowledges that comes out of Black feminist thought, that you can't just, fix, you can't just change the lighting in the room, and then, you might have to change the whole room up altogether. And I wonder, again, given the fact that you're the first curator of color at the High Museum, given your history working in various institutions, what are your thoughts around the ways museums are attempting to remain relevant to contemporary audiences, and to more diverse, not just ethnically or racially diverse, but diversity in terms of age, diversity in terms of status, or income levels, how museums are trying to navigate these evolving, changing, shifting waters as it relates to audience?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really big question. I think any museum uh, that's actually really interested in this they're all struggling with this right now. I think it's just there's a lot. The reason they're struggling isn't because they don't want to do it. I think they're struggling because you have to do so many things. The ways that people have been excluded are numerable. I mean, there's so many different things. The reason it's hard is because you have to undo all these things, right? It's just like, at the end of the exhibition on civil rights at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, you walk up and there's that wall of laws. Mm-hmm. It's like, even though these big acts passed, like the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, 1964 and 65, you still had to go through this process of undoing, and we're still in that process of undoing all the racist sort of bylaws and things, right? Mm-hmm. And that process could take hundreds of years just to get back to zero, which is why a lot of times people just say, like, blow the whole thing up, defund the whole thing, mm-hmm. Abolish this and that, because trying to reform is like insurmountably difficult, especially in the American context. Racism is everywhere. Mm-hmm. And so it's like trying to, one or two policies never fixes it, because there are thousands of them, millions of them, right? That we're contending with. And we have to kind of be in this ongoing process of fighting them all. Even when someone has stated, hey, this is wrong, there's still all this systemic stuff happening that we have to address. Trying to bite it off one by one is very, very hard. Mm-hmm. So I think one of to kind of stick with Helen's point, I think one of the things that has made me particularly proud of coming onto the High isn't necessarily because they've decided to go with a full Black curator, full-time curator, but that I don't have the traditional background.
Mm-hmm.
I think that things like having a PhD in art history, for example, even if you replace the person with a brown person, as she said, that, as I spoke to at the very beginning of this conversation, that is a very racist program at most
Mm-hmm.
universities,
Mm-hmm.
In the United States at least. And so you're still graduating people that have this Western bias, perhaps, right? In terms of what makes art good and how they think about any new art coming in, what they're comparing it to, even on subconscious levels, and things of that nature. So I think changing things like that, changing things like who is qualified for the job in the first place, right? Maybe the educational, maybe we need to look at educational standards altogether in terms of where that falls on a call for a position. Maybe it's not even on it anymore. I don't know. But I think if we're really trying to disrupt this sort of colonial legacy in museums, then we have to really be a bit drastic and a little bit uncomfortable. And that is because all of the things have this white Western bias, including education. So, right, I think those are some of the things that just have to be really critically looked at. I mean, the list is so long in terms of things that could be done,
right.
But that's something that stood out to me. I applied for this job. I didn't have any sort of art history degree. I thought I was qualified for it, so I applied anyway. And that didn't stop them from seriously considering me as a candidate and ultimately hiring me. I think it's going to take a lot of things like that. And I actually had a conversation early on with the chief curator of the High about that, about how I think the qualifications that are listed on a job posting automatically select out some of your most talented people, and we need to think about the biases that are implied in those qualifications requests. And so, yeah, I think that's a good place to start. That speaks specifically to my experience.
That's a really, really astute and brilliant observation. I'm really grateful for your perspective and the fact that you're coming to the table with a purview that is much broader and much different than perhaps one would expect or anticipate. Because to your point, I think that really does open up the possibility into new portals and new ways of engagement that might not otherwise be considered. So yeah, we're certainly grateful for you and certainly grateful for what you bring to the table, and looking forward to seeing what you do there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll ask again if anyone has any questions for Lauren. Please feel free to drop them in the chat or in the Q&A. It looks like we have one here. So this question comes from Douglas Martin. Hey, what's up, Douglas? It says, how important do you think the collecting of contemporary art by celebrities of color is? And do you think they have a higher burden to include artists from Africa when they know their collection may get more publicity due to their celebrity? Shall I read it again?
Yeah, please.
How important do you think the collecting of contemporary art by celebrities of color is? And do you think they have a higher burden to include artists from Africa when they know their collection may get more publicity due to their celebrity? So I'm assuming for this question, he's asking art by celebrities of color, collecting art by celebrities of color at institutions. Do they maybe trump collecting art from artists who are maybe lesser known from Africa? Again, thinking about one of the things that's been very problematic around museums is this idea of like capitalism, how capitalism informs museums and these kind of blockbuster shows and things of that nature. And so, when museums are collecting work by like big name artists, they may be overlooking the work by artists who don't have necessarily a name based on the fact that they're trying to draw people in.
I don't know. I don't know that celebrities set the trends on art collecting. Like, I mean, I think a lot of them decide to collect art as investments and so forth. But I don't know that. I mean, celebrities aren't even the wealthiest people, right? Like, I don't know. I think differently about the celebrity part of this than if the question were just like millionaires of color or something like that. I don't see a lot of celebrities advertising the art they collect in such a way that would make other people say, hey, I'm going to go collect from this same artist because my favorite singer has this work. I mean, but I do think that the people who are, frequently attending auction houses and bidding on things that are people of color should think about how they can play a role in adding value to African art based on how they bid and so forth. I don't know that those people are always celebrities, but I definitely think that I don't want to obligate anyone to anything, but I think it would be of interest to our people to make sure that we're supporting them in general, and so by extension, our artists in the diaspora, on the continent in the diaspora. But I also think you should go to a Black-owned coffee shop and support Black-owned clothiers and everything else to the extent that you can. And if you have more wealth, then you can support in different ways than people who are just local citizens, whether you're a celebrity or not.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree. But I do think it's interesting though, because I think there is a lot of sort of posturing and flexing amongst Black celebrities in terms of starting to collect art. It's now
okay.
It's now becoming sort of the bling, right?
That would be amazing. if it's like the new car,
right?
Like people are like, yeah, I got this for Hamu Pegu. Like, that would be incredible for the art market, for the Black art market.
Yeah.
I'm not quite seeing that yet, but I mean, in a very public way. I mean, we know people who are celebrities that collect art, but we just know them because we have proximity to the art world. I mean, the regular kid scrolling on Instagram, I don't think knows what Swiss Beats and Alicia Keys collection looks like. But we do, because you and I do, because we're in that world. But yeah, if it starts to be more public, if they start to be more public facing, then sure, there's value in that, because then we take care of the awareness problem that we were speaking about earlier. I think it's not a question of the talent, it's just people don't know it exists. And so if we can have people like celebrities, the value of celebrities is the visibility. If we could have celebrities sharing some of these artists, and that would really help take care of that issue.
Yeah, I would love to see more of that as well. Social media has become a really interesting place to discover and connect and experience art, especially in 2020. Everyone is now doing these virtual and digital galleries and exhibitions, and so it's been a really interesting time. I still don't know that digital. Well, I not even don't know. I don't think the digital space is quite convincing. Like, you miss a part of the experience of art, I think, in not seeing a physical piece, but I do think that it does allow for mobility and accessibility in ways that, perhaps museums are still attempting to try to get at, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of potential still there, I think. But Ms. Lauren, looks like we don't have any more questions for you.
Okay.
I really appreciate you taking the time to, oh wait, I'm sorry, man. Look, now there's like 3 just popped up all of a sudden. Let's see what we have here. I'll give you one more and then we'll wrap it up because I know you're tired and still traveling and things of that nature. Let's see what we have here. Okay, so I will go with this question. It says, "Hi Laura, we are wondering how the collections at the High will balance telling the story of antiquity and history on the African continent with contemporary and innovative creativity happening in all of the cities on the continent. Parallel to this is the connection with museums and African collectors on the continent." We are wondering how the collections will balance telling the story of antiquity and history with contemporary and innovative creativity. And then how does this parallel with museums and African collectors on the continent?
My goal would to be to always have those things in dialogue in the physical space. I don't, in other words, it's not my aim to separate antiquity from contemporary art on the continent. I very, very much want them to hold space together, and for there to be a discourse happening between the past and present and future. So that's my goal for how the collection is presented, at least. And I think that has to happen with the participation of African artists, African living artists, African collectors. And to our earlier point, Fahamu, there's not a lot of the contemporary African art being collected in the Americas. So I think I would necessarily have to engage collectors on the continent, in a bit in Europe. But I don't know another way to engage contemporary African art and objects without participation of collectors on the continent. If that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it brings up another interesting point too. We don't often think about collectors on the continent and how they are also driving that arts economy there. And so creating a space, creating opportunities for those dialogues, I think will be not only rich, but will also be transformative to our understanding of contemporary art.
And I don't even know how often they're engaged. I would be interested to learn. Like, there are African billionaires that have incredible collections. I don't know how often they are contacted. I look forward to that.
Yeah, that would be really, really exciting. Great question, Anja. So thank you again, Laura, for your time today. I'm gonna let you get back to your Sunday. And thank you to everybody for tuning in. This has been the ADAMA Art Salon. We look forward to seeing you for our next installment, and we encourage you to visit our website where you can see an archive of our previous conversations, as well as get more information about our upcoming conversations. And I should also announce that on December 1st, we'll be officially launching the ADAMA store. So you can enter or exit through the gift shop. It's your choice. We look forward to seeing you guys and continuing to bring you guys great programming. Thank you again, Lauren, for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Thank everyone for their questions.
And best of luck to you at the High Museum. We will
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.